though the sunlight streamed through the curtains in her bedroom, but it didn't brighten her mood. Adana Obi woke up feeling heavy. She sat on the edge of the bed, her head pounding. For weeks now she had been feeling off, tired, dizzy, and a strange taste in her mouth. She told herself it was probably stress. Running her fashion business wasn't easy. It kept her busy from morning till night, and with the big deal she was working on, she barely had time to breathe. But deep down she knew something wasn't right. She looked around the room. Everything was in its place just the way she liked it. The paintings on the wall, the vase of fresh flowers on the table, little touches that made the house feel like hers. Yet this home didn't feel as safe as it once did. Something had changed, though she couldn't say what. Her husband Tund walked in. He was dressed sharp as always, his shirt crisp, his shoes polished. Tund had a way of making everything look easy. He smiled as he walked over to her. "Morning," he said. "You don't look so good." Adana forced a small laugh. "Thanks for the compliment." "I'm serious," he said, his face soft with concern. "You've been looking tired. I'll make you some tea." He always did this, offered tea, checked on her, hovered. It should have been comforting. But lately it made her uneasy. "Sure," she said, trying to keep her voice calm. As soon as he left the room, her heart started racing. She wasn't sure when the doubt had started creeping in. Maybe it was a few weeks ago when the dizziness began. Maybe it was after her friend Ijeoma planted the idea in her head. "Are you sure it's just stress?" Ijeoma had asked during lunch one day. "You've been working hard, sure, but it sounds like something else. Is Tund acting strange?" Adana had laughed it off then. Tund? Strange? He was her husband, her partner. They had built a life together. But now as she sat there she wasn't so sure. Tund came back with the tea. He handed her the cup and sat beside her. "Drink this," he said. "You'll feel better." Adana smiled, brought the cup to her lips and pretended to sip. The tea was warm, comforting, and tasted normal. But she couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't. "Thanks," she said, placing the cup on the nightstand. Tund kissed her forehead. "Get some rest," he said. "I'll check on you later." When he left, Adana stared at the tea. She couldn't drink it. Not now. Not with this fear sitting heavy in her chest. What if Ijeoma was right? What if something was wrong and Tund had something to do with it? She picked up her phone and called Ijeoma. Her best friend answered on the second ring. "Hey, how are you feeling?" "I don't know," Adana said. "It's getting worse." "Worse how?" "The dizziness. The tiredness. And the tea, he keeps making me tea." There was a pause on the other end. Then Ijeoma said, "Adana, you need to find out what's going on. Don't just sit there. Do something." "What should I do?" "Talk to someone. A doctor. A private investigator. Someone who can help." Adana sighed. The idea of hiring someone to look into her husband felt wrong. They were married. Partners. You weren't supposed to spy on your partner. But this wasn't a normal situation. By the next afternoon, Adana had called a private investigator. Musa Abdullahi was a quiet, serious man who listened more than he spoke. She told him about her symptoms, the tea, and her growing suspicions. "I'll look into it," Musa said. "In the meantime, keep acting normal. Don't let him know you're suspicious." That was easier said than done. Every time Tund smiled at her, every time he brought her tea or asked how she was feeling, Adana had to fight the urge to pull away. She watched him closely now, noticing little things she hadn't before. How he checked on her a little too often, how his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. Musa worked quickly. Within days he had found receipts for strange chemicals Tund had purchased. Some of them could be used as medicine. Others, Musa explained, could be dangerous if used the wrong way. He also uncovered that Tund had visited unregistered pharmacies and spoken to people who didn't seem like doctors. Adana's fear grew. The man she had loved for years, the man she had trusted with her life, now felt like a stranger. Could he really be capable of something so terrible? Or was she imagining things? One night, unable to sleep, she wandered into Tund's study. The room smelled faintly of his cologne. She opened his desk drawer and found it locked. Her hands trembled as she ran her fingers over the smooth wood. What was he hiding? The next morning, as she pretended to sip her tea, she watched him carefully. His face gave away nothing. He acted like the same caring husband he had always been. But Adana wasn't sure she could believe it anymore. The final straw came when she overheard him on the phone. He was in his study speaking quietly, but she could hear enough. "It's working," he said. "But I can't let her find out yet." Adana froze, her heart pounding. She crept back to bed, her mind racing. What was working? What couldn't he let her find out? She knew then that she couldn't keep pretending. Whatever was happening, she needed answers. And she needed them soon. Adana spent the next few days feeling like she was walking on a tightrope. Every move she made felt watched, even when Tund wasn't in the room. She couldn't shake the feeling that something bad was coming. She continued her routine, smiling when Tund asked how she was feeling, pretending to drink the tea he made and keeping her suspicions hidden. But inside she felt trapped. Musa kept digging, feeding her bits and pieces of information. He found more receipts, odd purchases that didn't make sense. Chemicals, medicines, things a regular person wouldn't need. He even followed Tund to a pharmacy that wasn't on any official list. When Musa asked around, people either didn't know much or didn't want to talk. That only made Adana more uneasy. She started paying closer attention to everything. One night she noticed a strange smell coming from the tea. It wasn't strong, but it was there, bitter, almost metallic. She didn't drink it, of course. She hadn't touched the tea in days. She poured it out quietly in the sink when Tund wasn't looking. But it stayed with her, that smell. The more she thought about it, the more memories came back. There were times Tund had insisted she eat or drink something specific. Times when he seemed unusually concerned about her health, even before her symptoms started. Was it care? Or something else? She decided to test him. One evening, when Tund handed her the tea, she smiled and asked, "What's in it?" "Just herbs," he said, his tone easy. "It's good for you." "What kind of herbs?" she pressed, keeping her voice light. "Nothing special," he replied, brushing it off. "Why do you ask?" "I was just curious," she said. But she saw something in his eyes, just for a moment, a flicker of something like worry. That night she couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about how much her life had changed. She used to feel so safe with Tund. Now she felt like she didn't know him at all. The next day she met with Musa in a quiet cafe across town. He brought more news. Tund had been meeting with someone, a man who wasn't a doctor but seemed to know a lot about medicine. Musa showed her pictures. The man looked ordinary enough, but the way he and Tund were talking in the photos seemed serious, almost secretive. "What do you think he's up to?" Adana asked. Musa shook his head. "I don't know yet. But I'll find out." That evening back at home, Tund seemed unusually cheerful. He talked about plans for the weekend, suggesting they take a short trip to unwind. Adana nodded along, but her mind was elsewhere. She needed answers. Over the next few days things grew more intense. Adana started feeling worse. Whether from stress or whatever was happening to her, she wasn't sure. Tund noticed, of course. He kept asking if she was okay, offering more tea, more attention. It was almost suffocating. She pretended to go along with it, but inside she was gathering strength. She started hiding small bits of food and drink that he gave her, planning to have them tested later. It wasn't easy. She had to be careful not to let him see. Then came the night she finally found something. Tund had left his study unlocked, probably by mistake. Adana waited until she was sure he was asleep, then slipped inside. Her heart was pounding as she opened the desk drawer he always kept locked. Inside she found a notebook filled with handwritten notes. She couldn't make sense of most of it. Chemical names, dosages, and strange diagrams. But one thing stood out, her name. He had written it several times, underlined, next to phrases like monitor closely and treatment adjustment. Her stomach turned as she flipped through the pages. Was this proof of what she feared? Or was it something else? He didn't know. She took pictures of the pages with her phone, her hands shaking the whole time. Then she closed the drawer and left the study, her mind racing. The next day she showed the photos to Musa. He looked grim as he studied them. "This isn't normal," he said. "Whatever he's doing, it's not simple." Adana felt like the ground was falling out from under her. She didn't want to believe Tund could hurt her, but the evidence was piling up. That evening Tund made dinner. He served her a bowl of soup, insisting she eat to build her strength. Adana stared at the bowl, her appetite gone. She pushed the soup around with her spoon, pretending to eat, while Tund watched her with what looked like genuine concern. "Are you feeling any better?" he asked. "A little," she lied. "Thank you." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Later that night, Adana poured the soup into a plastic bag and hid it in the freezer. She would have it tested like the other samples. She didn't know what she expected to find, but she had to know the truth. Her health kept getting worse. The dizziness came more often. Her hands shook sometimes and she felt weak, like her body was giving up on her. Every time Tun noticed, he looked almost sad. He told her she needed rest, that he was doing everything he could to help her. But was he? Adana started doubting herself. What if she was wrong? What if Tund really was trying to help her? He had never given her a reason to doubt him before. Was she letting fear cloud her judgment? She couldn't decide. But the tests would tell her the truth. And until then, she had to keep playing the part of the trusting wife, even though every moment felt like a lie. Adana sat at the dining table, her hands gripping her cup of water so tightly she thought it might break. Tun sat across from her, calm as ever, flipping through the day's newspaper. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the air conditioner. She had been waiting for this moment, planning it for days. Every doubt, every suspicion, every piece of evidence she had gathered was screaming at her to act. Her heart raced, but she forced herself to stay steady. "Tund," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He looked up, his face soft with concern. "What is it? You look pale. Do you need your tea?" Adana shook her head. She couldn't pretend anymore. "I know what you've been doing." His expression didn't change, but she saw the way his shoulders tensed just slightly. "What are you talking about?" She set the cup down and met his gaze. "The tea. The pills I never asked for. You've been poisoning me." For a moment neither of them spoke. The words hung in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. Tund leaned back in his chair, his face unreadable. "Poisoning you," he said at last, his tone almost amused. "Adana, that's ridiculous." "It's not," she said firmly. "I have proof. The test came back. There's something in the food. Something that's been making me sick." Tun didn't deny it. Instead, he sighed and looked at her with an expression that almost seemed sad. "You've been spying on me." "You gave me no choice," she shot back. "What are you trying to do, Tund? Kill me? Take my money? I trusted you." At that he laughed, a low, bitter sound that sent chills down her spine. "Kill you," he said, shaking his head. "Adana, you've got it all wrong. I'm trying to save you." The room seemed to spin for a moment. Save her? What was he talking about? "Stop lying," she said, her voice shaking. "I heard you on the phone. I saw the notebook. You've been planning this for weeks." Tund leaned forward, his eyes locked on hers. "You're sick, Adana. Really sick. And you don't even know it." Her chest tightened. "What are you talking about?" He took a deep breath as if trying to steady himself. "You have a condition," he said. "Something rare, something the doctors haven't found yet. But I know it's there. I've seen the signs." Adana stared at him, trying to make sense of his words. "And you think poisoning me is the cure?" "It's not poison," he said sharply. "It's medicine. Experimental, yes. But it's the only thing that can help you." She shook her head, refusing to believe him. "You expect me to trust you after everything? After you kept this from me?" "I had to," he said, his voice rising. "You wouldn't have understood. You would have refused. And now I'm supposed to just believe you?" Tund stood up, pacing the room. "I didn't want it to be this way," he said. "I wanted to protect you. I've been working with a specialist, someone who knows about this condition. They said it was the only way." Adana felt her anger bubbling to the surface. "So, instead of telling me, you decided to play God with my life? You let me think I was dying." "I didn't let you think anything," he snapped. "I did what I had to do. For you." The weight of his words crushed her. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that this was all some twisted attempt to help her. But the fear, the betrayal, it was all too much. "And what happens if you're wrong?" she asked quietly. "I'm not wrong," he said, his voice firm. "I've done the research. I've seen the signs. And it's working, isn't it? You're still here." "That doesn't make it right," she said. Tun stopped pacing and turned to her. "You think I wanted this? You think I wanted to watch you suffer? Every time you looked at me like I was the enemy, it killed me." She felt tears sting her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "You should have told me," she said. "I deserved to know." He nodded, his face heavy with regret. "Maybe I should have. But I was scared. Scared that you wouldn't believe me. Scared that you'd give up." Adana stood, her legs trembling beneath her. "I don't know if I can forgive you for this." Tun didn't say anything. He just stood there, his face etched with something between sorrow and defiance. She walked past him heading for the door. "I'm going to the doctor," she said. "A real doctor. And if I find out you've lied to me again." She didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. As she left the room, she felt the weight of everything pressing down on her. The man she had loved, the man she had trusted, had turned her life into a nightmare. Whether his intentions were good or not didn't matter. What mattered was that he had taken away her choice. And she wasn't sure if she could ever trust him again. Adana sat in the doctor's office, her hands resting on her lap. She'd spent the last week going through every test they could think of, blood work, scans, even a specialist consultation. The waiting had been torture. But now the results were in, and she braced herself for what the doctor would say. Dr. Okonkwo, a calm woman with kind eyes, looked up from the papers in her hands. "Your results are clear," she said. "There's no sign of any serious illness." Adana felt a wave of relief so strong it almost knocked the breath out of her. But then just as quickly anger bubbled up. If she wasn't sick, then everything Tund had said was a lie. "What about the symptoms?" she asked. "The dizziness, the weakness?" "I've been feeling awful for weeks." Dr. Okonkwo nodded. "Stress can do that. Anxiety. But I'd also like to test any food or drinks you've consumed recently. You mentioned concerns about possible tampering." Adana handed over the samples she had secretly collected. As the doctor took them, she felt a knot in her chest tighten. Part of her still wanted to believe Tund's story. But the other part of her, the one that had stayed up nights fearing for her life, knew better. When she got home, Tund was waiting for her in the living room. He stood as she walked in, his face lined with worry. "What did the doctor say?" he asked. Adana stared at him, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm not sick." His expression didn't change, but she saw the way his hands clenched at his sides. "That's good news," he said quietly. "Is it?" she asked, crossing her arms. "Because it means you've been lying to me." Tund sighed and sat down, running a hand over his face. "Adana, I wasn't lying. I told you I was trying to help." "Help me how?" she demanded. "By poisoning me? By making me think I was dying?" "It wasn't poison," he said firmly. "It was a treatment. Something that could stop the symptoms before they got worse." "But there was nothing to treat," she shot back. "You made it all up. You decided I was sick and took it upon yourself to fix me. Do you even hear how insane that sounds?" Tund looked at her, his eyes pleading. "I didn't make it up. I saw the signs. I did the research. I thought I was protecting you." Adana shook her head. "You weren't protecting me. You were controlling me. You didn't trust me enough to make my own choices." For a long time neither of them spoke. The silence in the room was thick, heavy with all the words left unsaid. Finally Tund broke it. "I thought I was doing the right thing," he said. "I thought I was saving you. But I see now that I went about it the wrong way. I'm sorry." Adana wanted to believe him. She wanted to think that his actions, as misguided as they were, had come from a place of love. But the hurt was too deep. "I need time," she said. "I can't just forgive this. You broke my trust, Tund. And I don't know if we can come back from that." He nodded, his shoulders slumping. "I understand," he said. The days that followed were hard. Adana kept her distance, avoiding Tund whenever she could. She focused on her work, throwing herself into her designs and trying to find a sense of normalcy. The test results from the food samples came back a week later. Dr. Okonkwo confirmed that there had been chemicals present. Substances that, while not immediately toxic, could cause her symptoms if taken over time. When she told Tund, he didn't argue. He just looked at her with sad eyes and said, "I'm sorry." Eventually, Adana decided to move out for a while. She needed space to think, to heal, to figure out what her next steps would be. Tund didn't try to stop her. He seemed to understand that this was something she had to do. Living on her own was strange at first. The house felt quiet, almost too quiet. But slowly she started to find herself again. She reconnected with friends, spent time doing things she loved, and began to feel like her old self. One evening, as she sat on her balcony watching the sun set, she realized something. She was stronger than she had given herself credit for. She had faced one of the hardest challenges of her life and come out the other side. And while she wasn't sure what the future held for her and Tund, she knew one thing for certain. She would never let anyone take away her voice again. Adana decided to focus on herself for now. She didn't close the door on reconciliation, but she made it clear to Tund that if they were ever to rebuild what they had, it would have to be on her terms. No more secrets. No more lies. Tund agreed, though his eyes held the weight of his mistakes. Whether he could earn back her trust was a question only time could answer. For Adana, the lesson was clear. Love wasn't about control. It was about respect, honesty, and choice. And no matter how much someone claimed to care, those were things she would never compromise on again. As the weeks turned into months, Adana felt herself growing stronger, more confident. She wasn't just surviving, she was thriving. And in the end, that was the best revenge of all.